Okay. Hello. Let's get straight into it. Thank you for your patience. Sorry for the extra delay.
Great.
Please introduce yourself to our audience and tell them a little bit about who you are.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm Jezmina von Thiele. I am a tarot and tea leaf reader in my mixed Romani family tradition. I do readings in person in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and online. And I'm also a writer of creative writing of all kinds. And I co-wrote a book with Paulina Stevens called Secrets of Romani Fortune Telling, who is also my co-host for our podcast, Romanistan Podcast.
Gotcha. So you're both on today. So how did you end up getting together and deciding to do a podcast together? And what's the specific topic of your podcast?
Actually, I'm just going to let Paulina introduce herself as well, and then we'll get into that.
So I'm Paulina, and I do all that stuff with Jez. And so I own my own holistic healing store in Laguna Beach, California. But it's just like a private practice, so I work with people from all over. It's also an online business, and I also, um, sorry, I'm just kind of like, what else do I do besides the podcast and the book? I think that's pretty much everything. I'm also a mom. Yeah, we wrote the book Secrets of Romani Fortune Telling, and so that's why we are here today.
Yeah, and Romanistan Podcast is a celebration of Romani culture. A lot of people don't realize that the word Roma refers to a diasporic ethnic group originally from India, also known by the racial slur gypsies, which, depending on where you live, may be used more or less neutrally. Um, so we're not Romanians and we're not Romans. We're Roma. And Roma have been persecuted worldwide, which is ongoing since early Roma left India around the 10th century and arrived in Europe, probably the late 1300s, and have also shaped culture and spiritual practices in a lot of really significant ways that are often underdocumented and underacknowledged. And so tarot, tea leaf reading, palmistry. That's what Paulina and I do as our family trades, even though we grew up in separate families across the country from each other. But those trades have been so influenced and sometimes even created by or pioneered by Romani people. And it's so infrequently discussed that we decided to write a whole book about it. So our podcast, Romanistan Podcast, is an opportunity to interview Roma from all different walks of life, doing all kinds of fascinating things, traditional and non-traditional. Whereas the book is focused on, Secrets of Romani Fortune Telling. It's focused on tarot, palmistry, tea leaf reading, and more. But we also talk about cultural context and history and what it was like growing up doing what we do. So it's a little memoir, it's a little how-to, it's a little culture and history.
Awesome. Well, let's start off with what it was like growing up doing what you do, because I'm super interested in that, and that sounds like there's some awesome stories there. So, what was it like growing up in that context, in that cultural context with, it sounds like fortune telling as a family trade, I think you said.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was that like for both of you?
Yeah, Paulina, you want to share first?
Sure. So my parents owned small holistic healing or psychic parlors throughout California, and or I would say they operated these stores. We didn't like own these stores, sometimes we even lived in our stores. But fortune telling has really been a survival trade for myself and for my family. And growing up with it, I grew up in community, so I wasn't really in the outside world too much. I was taken out of elementary school strictly to focus on fortune telling and to like prepare for marriage and stuff like that.
Wow.
So yeah, like I had an arranged marriage, which I actually talk about on a podcast series with LA Times called Foretold, if anyone wants to check that out. But that's kind of what it was like for us, is like we had to do fortune telling. Like we weren't allowed to have any other jobs or even any other interests at that point. It was just like, you're going to do fortune telling, and that's it. So as I got older, I kind of like, um, I kind of actually resented it for a little while. Like a couple years, I was like, I don't want to do fortune telling. But of course, I fell back into it because I absolutely love it.
So why was it pushed so much?
So throughout, it's such a long history, but Romani people are usually were known as like travelers, gypsies, like we traveled the world and stuff like that. But truthfully, we were pushed out of our communities through war and slavery and just a lot of bad stuff like that. So we needed to figure out a way to, or not figure out a way. I mean, these are our trades, but these are things that you can do on the move. Like you can entertain, you can dance, you can fortune tell, like you can play music, like you can do things like that. And that's what my family has done throughout their life here. I obviously don't speak for all Roma, I don't speak for all gypsies, but that's what it was like for us.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah, I had a different experience, and I think also what Paulina talks a lot about in Foretold is that a lot of Romani kids are bullied out of schools, or their families don't want them to attend school because of the bullying, the racism, but also traditional culture, which I didn't grow up in, is different than American culture or whatever the dominant culture is. And so there can be, because of centuries of persecution, there can also be a fear of becoming too intermixed. And then I am one of those people who is very intermixed. um, I grew up assimilated. Only my maternal grandmother is Romani, but I was very, very close to her growing up, and she left Germany shortly after World War II, where Romani people and Sinti people, it's just a subgroup of Roma, were persecuted alongside Jewish folks and other ethnic, religious, political minorities. And my grandmother, when she came to America, really wanted to hide her ethnicity. She felt like it was hard enough being a German immigrant. She didn't want anyone to know that she was Romani as well. She came over alone, which is very, very unusual. And by the time I came around, she was very afraid of our culture just dying out in our family. And so from when I was 4, she raised me to do everything that she could remember and recall from her own childhood, where she was kind of hiding in plain sight in Germany, and also living with a non-Romani person who was shielding them, but that's complicated. Um, but so I grew up with this understanding that I was meant to keep my ethnicity a secret, which Paulina also, grew up that way as well. Um, but also knowing that I could do other work if I wanted to, but this was the family trade and this is what we did. And this was important for her to share with me. But it was the best part of my childhood for me. But I had the freedom of choice and I had access to all the education I wanted. So they're different stories, but the idea of these being survival trades was the same theme for both of us.
It sounds like both of you have had a journey. I'm curious. I mean, it sounds like both of you would have had a journey from feeling like you needed to hide your ethnicity to now doing a podcast and a book about it. So maybe talk about how that journey has gone. I know there's probably a lot of steps along it, but
Um, I feel also as surprised as everybody else, I think. I didn't think that I would ever really want to even like communicate about the culture, like the things I've been through personally, the things that I want to advocate for. And what inspired me was Jess actually. So Jess was someone I was just getting out into the culture, like I had left my community, and Jess was talking and advocating for Roma around the world and just educating people. And I really kind of felt inspired by them and others that were doing similar things. And I was like, I think if there's anything I could at least do is contribute to society with the knowledge that I have, I guess. And then we just kind of got here. But what do you think, Jess?
Yeah, I mean, I was so it was such an interesting time when you reached out to me because I think every person who has like mixed ethnic background is always like, where do I belong? How much should I be talking or not talking? But I just was so I just adored my grandmother. She was so wonderful. And it really pained me to understand that so much of our intergenerational trauma, inherited trauma, came from the persecution of Roma, war, all kinds of things, genocide, all the hot topics. And so I wanted to do something about it. I'm a writer. That was mostly what I was doing back then, and I was an academic. And then when Paulina reached out to me, it was just shortly after my mother had died, and I was kind of processing, and it's like, give me a few months. And Paulina was like, perfect. So, yeah, we decided to launch the podcast both as a celebration of Romani culture, but also a safe space for Romani Sinti related folks who don't maybe fit what's traditional. We both come from imperfect backgrounds. None of us are perfect Roma. And we wanted it to be a place also for LGBTQ plus Roma, disabled Roma, Roma who are mixed, or maybe doing work that challenges tradition in some way, and just an opportunity for us to look at how our culture continues to evolve and celebrate that evolution.
Cool. How I know this is a big generalization, but how do Roma in general view fortune telling, and do they have views about fortune telling as it's practiced outside of a Roma context, like by everyone else?
That's such a good question. Paulina, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think it's crazy because the way that we view it, I say we as in a community as a whole, is so differently just like the rest of the world. Like some Roma are super like, I don't know why, but like Christian and for some reason or Catholic, and they feel like fortune telling is really wrong because of their religion. Some others feel like, they completely believe in it and trust in it, and kind of like you get a combination really, I think, in every family. There's just a little bit of everything, kind of like some people believe in it, some people don't. I think like anything, it's just I think we practice it. I would say, I don't know if I could be politically wrong or not. I mean, who knows? But I would say a lot of Roma, I think, are familiar with it and practice it, at least the Roma that I know or that I deal with. But definitely not all, and everybody views it differently. Some people get into it, some people leave, but that's kind of my view. But what do you think?
Yeah, and I agree with all of that and would add to it as well that I think it can be really complicated for Roma who maybe are in academia and they see it as like, oh no, y'all are still doing fortune telling. That's so embarrassing. Makes us look
Mhm.
bad. But we had the wonderful Romani feminist and academic Ethel Brooks on our podcast, who very astutely pointed out that fortune telling has traditionally been mostly women's work and mostly the emotional labor, which is, consistently undervalued. And Romani culture is a patriarchal culture. And yeah, so we think that fortune telling has been undervalued more for that reason.
Hmm.
Of course, people misuse it and can scam and do other things that we, don't condone, but it can sometimes be dismissed as superstition. But for other families, it's, my grandmother was so proud of it. It was something that she really believed in. And she was also like very casual about it, where when I was 4, she taught me to meditate. And she's like, perfect, open your mind to God and just tell everyone what God says. And it was just seemed so normal. And so, Roma feel differently about it all over the world. But then to the second part of your question, how do Roma feel about non-Roma practicing? Also complicated. So um, some Roma feel very, very strongly that tarot and related practices that Roma have either evolved or created should be closed practices, and people shouldn't be practicing them. Other Roma feel that they are at the point where they're so intermixed with our, mainstream culture that ideally Romani voices would be recentered in these conversations. And you would go to Romani teachers and you would read books by Roma about these things, and you would make an effort to learn the cultural context and collaborate with Roma in these spaces
Hmm.
and sort of
Hmm.
use your platforms to invite people in.
Hmm.
We tend to be of that opinion. And then there are other Roma who just simply couldn't care less and are like, that's not the most important thing that we're facing right now. So
Gotcha.
there's room for all of it.
So how I'm actually unclear about where the current academic consensus is on the origin of tarot and some of the other, you know, divination tools that have come into Europe. I mean, I've definitely heard the story that Roma brought tarot into Europe, potentially from India, but I'm
Mhm.
curious where the current thinking on that is.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely not speaking for all academics because academics usually ignore us. But
No,
from
yeah, yeah.
from our perspective, and what we write about in the book is that, for instance, tarot was created in Italy, but likely inspired by earlier decks like the Mamluk cards and that were coming from West Asia and further east. And Romani people arrived in Italy around the same time that these cards were first created and were the first people to use them as divination tools and quickly turned it into a divination practice that started to really light up, especially around the Victorian era, became very trendy along with tea leaf reading and palmistry. So palmistry is originally an Ayurvedic practice. It's an Indian art. Early Roma would have taken it with them. But before Roma
Hmm.
left India, it had also traveled along the Silk Road. And so you have, Chinese variations of palm reading and other parts of Asia, which is fascinating and very fun. But Roma popularized what we are familiar with as Western palm reading, which is actually Indian palm reading. And of course, Roma are not all Roma, actually. I know some Ayurvedic practitioners like Jeneline Joseph who are also Roma. But, we've changed things over time. And tea leaf reading and coffee reading has existed as long as these drinks have been consumed. But again, Romani people popularized it, brought it west, and have basically, like, if we think about branding a lot these days, like Roma have branded all of these things, but because of persecution, have not really been given credit for it. And so you have phenomena like, in the Victorian era, society ladies dressing up in brown face and Romani costume to give each other tea leaf readings, or palm readings or card readings. And they were mimicking the Romani, usually women, but sometimes men too, who were going, door to door selling fortunes. So, for a long time, Roma origin has been removed
Hmm.
from this work.
What about where is people's thinking at currently about the Indian origins of the Roma?
I mean, I don't think there's a lot of debate about it
Okay.
in terms of scholarship. Like, scholars are confident. Of course, you have people who feel a certain way about that, and maybe not all Roma believe it. I certainly didn't even know about it until I was well into my 20s. I mean, my grandmother had no idea that Roma were from India. But as far as like linguistic research and DNA and all of that, it's like pretty clear northwestern India, Pakistan.
Okay. Was it Gujarat?
I
Um,
would say, oh, sorry.
no, go
Answer,
ahead.
you can answer.
I didn't that region you mean?
Yeah.
Probably like more Rajasthan.
More Rajasthan. Okay. I've been
Mhm.
to Rajasthan. It's super, super nice
Oh,
there. That actually makes
yay.
sense, just by the art style. That's interesting. The
Yeah.
Jains started in Rajasthan also. Interesting. So it sounds to me, I'm just at a guess if the Roma were traveling along the Silk Road, it sounds like they could have played a really crucial role in cultural interchange. And I just know just from my own studies how porous things were back in the day. There weren't really these clear divisions between spiritual practices, and so much of it was exchanged along the Silk Road. It seems to me like
Um,
potentially the Roma were just more connected because they were traveling more.
There's a really interesting history as well about how the Roma people became Roma. it's likely that early Roma were low caste Indians and possibly also African migrants who, around the 10th century were rounded up to fight the invading Ghaznavid Empire. And that war went on for, I think,
But
over
I've never
100
heard of that
years.
empire. What is that?
Oh, yeah. The Ghaznavid Empire is a very long-spanning empire I'm summarizing and being real, real basic, but I suggest people look it up. Um, it was, oops, it would be like present day West Asia, Middle East. Just like want to make sure that okay, existed from 977 until 1186. And basically it was an enormous political, cultural dynasty that was moving east. And so when they were invading present day India, it would have been just around the 10th century, massive army. It's a really interesting because it took place over so many years. There's like all these different rulers and reigns that you could get really nerdy about, but I'm gonna skip that because I'm not an expert in it. Um, but basically, when they were invading India, um, the early Roma were asked to fight or made to fight. They were allowed to create camps outside of the battlefield because they were fighting for, like almost a century. Whole families were born and raised on these camps outside of the battlefield. So a whole generation of people, a whole culture of people were created. And then they lost. And so they were captured by the Ghaznavid army and brought west. And so early Roma were likely prisoners for at least most or a significant amount. Some might have gone of their own volition, some might have gone back to India. So that's a really interesting cultural origin. And then we're enslaved in present day Romania for 500 years from the
Wow.
1370s until like just 10 years before the sort of emancipation in
That's
the
probably a
United States.
shit place to be enslaved too.
Yeah, it was really bad. No reparations have been paid. It's not even taught in Romanian or European history.
Not
It's
that it's
wild.
good anywhere, but just
Yeah,
Romania.
no,
Yeah.
it's not great. And also a lot of Romani people became part of the transatlantic slave trade and started coming to the US around that time too. And so their
Really?
Romani population, yeah, the
Huh.
Romani populations in like Louisiana,
Really?
yeah,
How we got
Caribbean.
here? No, some of us. That's how some of my family got here. Yeah.
Huh. What
Yeah.
time period was that?
So that would have been like the start of the transatlantic slave trade in the US would have been when Roma started also
Wow.
being transported.
Is
Like
there,
late 800s, maybe?
Um let's see. I think it would be like 1400s, but I'm just going to double check cuz I am too nervous to remember.
I'm
um
curious if just because of, I just actually just got back from a vacation in New Orleans, and there's so many different cultural influences there and so much magic, obviously. I'm curious if there was any influence by Roma on Louisiana.
yeah, definitely. So it
What's up with that? I'm super curious.
looks like 1500s.
Okay.
So yeah, and that is definitely why also Paulina and I and Bimbo Yaga of New Orleans, who also is known as Ilva Roma Marjana Rajajevsky, we're creating a Welcome to Romanistan festival in New Orleans this year from December 4th and to the 8th.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, to celebrate Romani influence. And so when you have different marginalized ethnic groups all marginalized together, there's going to be a certain amount of intermarrying and friendship and relationship. And so Afro-Romani culture is really fascinating there. There's indigenous Romani culture. There's a mixture of all those three
This is
cultures.
still in New Orleans.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. I'll have to
And
look out for that next time I'm there.
Yeah, so we're doing the festival to celebrate that and to celebrate the book, and there'll be tea leaf reading salons and like family dinner and uh, arts and culture performances. It'll be really fun.
Awesome. So you mentioned, and which I agree with you, not just on this, but on any spiritual practice or tradition, the idea of going to the originators and asking to see it in context, respectfully. I'm a big proponent on that, and not people not making up their own versions of things. I mean, even if you go to an actual Buddhist or Hindu temple, it's so different from what people think of as yoga or meditation or things like this. So I'm a big proponent of that. And and that's a fascinating idea to me when it comes to things like tarot, because this is a podcast about magic. People are interested in the occult. And tarot is never one you hear people talking about going to get the cultural context in. So my question there is twofold. One is, what are people missing and of what you're comfortable sharing? And two, if somebody was to go to learn about those topics from Romani people, what would that be like? And how would it be different from how it's normally viewed? I mean, everyone's got their own version of it, but I think you know what I mean.
Paulina, I want to hear your answer to that first.
Um, Sorry, can you kind of like ask it again?
Okay, so
Version?
if somebody okay, so most of the people who listen to this podcast are interested in magic and learning it. So if somebody were to come to an actual Romani fortune teller to learn about tarot and fortune telling from them, what would they learn and what distinctions would they pick up that would be different from what they're getting kind of in the general public?
Yeah, so I feel like for one, like I said, this is our cultural practice and our cultural trade. So we have just a tremendous amount of experience in it from a really young age. I would say the people that are offering services to teach it, because you can't really just go to any, gypsy fortune teller and learn from them. But I would say that it's tremendously different when you are genuinely interested in learning about the history and cultural context and um, the cultural practice part of tarot and fortune telling. So that's the thing is there's just I think it's kind of like black and white. Like anybody can, I think pick up a book and just read the what the meaning is for something. But I think when someone is there to kind of coach you through the process, but also um the lived experience. So I mean the fortune teller, lived experience, it's like, we have this from a kid or most of the time, as a child growing up with this and all the different types of experience, like I think it's just a difference to that degree. But at the same time, I recommend a lot of books outside of what Romani people are writing as well. So it's like I think it's probably great to know the history, the cultural context, but I would say look at everything. You know what I mean? It's all one big spiritual world.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the reason why we wanted to write our book too is that for a long time, non-Romani authors on tarot were the only sources.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have come to like love and appreciate them while also recognizing that what we do is a little different. And so we can appreciate the way that tarot has evolved, but there are certain things that are really uniquely Romani, the way that we approach spiritual hygiene with reading and how, making sure that the space is a certain way before you start reading for your well-being, the client's well-being. We have professionalism built into reading that a lot of people don't. And if you've ever been to a reader who wasn't particularly professional, you'll see why that matters. And so we have a certain way of handling bad news and
Okay.
explaining it as good advice instead. There's a certain way of non-judgment in everything that your client can come to you with. Really, if you're a Romani reader, like nothing can shock you. You've heard everything. And that's really priceless as well, because people come in with all kinds of really difficult things where that they might be struggling with. They might have done something that they are ashamed of or struggling with. But then there's also the element of it, like Paulina was saying, that it's a lived experience in a different kind of way. And so we have this section of our book where we talk about cultural trauma and intuition and how, Roma are not uniquely magical people. It's our lived experience, but also intergenerational trauma as well as present day trauma can make certain people very attuned to human behavior. And
Yeah.
we've had to historically as a whole people be able to read a vibe and read a situation really quick.
Yeah. Wow.
And so that's an enormous part of what we do is both the practical and the spiritual aspect of intuition. And then, of course, we have our own personal spiritual practices. And we shared some of them that have become more mainstream, but we have lots of things that are closed practice that we'll never write about because people don't need to know. But we like to try to give context to the things that are already out there in the world. And it's like, oh, okay. So if you've heard about maybe why you shouldn't talk about your projects while they're being developed, here's our opinion on that. And here are some things that you can do to protect your energy.
What is your opinion on that, actually? Because that's something I think about a lot. I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean,
Don't talk about it.
Yeah, Paulina, I want you to answer that.
I'm superstitious, and like I believe things like that, like we're popularized from our people too, because we're so superstitious about it, and we have been for for 1,000 years, where it's like, I think there must be some kind of science around it, where it's like, if you want something to happen, the way I explain it to people sometimes is like, if you want something to happen, or if you're a reader and like, let's say the cards are saying like, oh, you got a promotion. And then the guy like goes around and tells everyone at the office, like, I'm getting a promotion. But then like the manager's like, I was thinking about it, but now I'm not because you're being cocky or whatever. And then it changes the course or whatever it is. Like maybe there is obviously some kind of just social thing to it, but we feel like until it's in our hands, like we don't want to be putting the energy out there and telling people like that, like we got it, like if we didn't, or we're gonna get it, because anything could happen. But at the same time, it really does contradict a lot of the like manifestation. Like you have to envision it. It's more of like this silent, like purely emotional brain manifestation, but not so much of like the speaking manifestation of like, yeah, like I got it, or this or that. We're more of like, when you actually got it, like you actually got it, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's always, if I understand what you said, right? I mean, that's always a tricky one with magic. It's kind of like you're not supposed to talk about it. And often with a lot of forms of magic, you're not even supposed to think about it. Yet that contradicts kind of what you were saying, the positive affirmation or visualization, or, it's like these are two totally different philosophies towards magic, and they tend to blur together for people and become kind of confusing. So I'm curious where you kind of navigate that inner zone between those two things.
I'll just say what I do really quick is I have to find a balance between both. So that's where I feel like sometimes I tell clients, like, right here and now, like, what is it that you want? Like, write it down, envision it, but then like obviously don't go around like talking about it, or boasting about it with anyone. So that's kind of the way that I navigate it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I have a similar approach. And my family was always so worried about other people's jealousy and how that can impact energetically, but also practically. People get jealous and they act wild. And so I think being humble is just a nice in between where you can make all your wish making and ritual or prayer or whatever you want, but like stay humble, stay focused.
Gotcha. It's just to rewind just a little bit. It's a really profound comment you've made about intergenerational trauma. One thing that I can't help but have noticed after 25 years of being around magical people and teaching magic is how common childhood trauma is. And it's for the reason that you said, which is that people who grow up in that environment need to get really, really good at reading situations and subtleties and unspokens and changes in facial expression and things like that. So that, and often extreme trauma can produce out of body experiences. So I've noticed that, but I have never considered that from the intergenerational perspective, which is a lot. That's a lot. Anyways, I'm curious, maybe just to talk about that a little bit more, just because I'm uncertain what that would look like in a family context.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like so many different Romani families could answer that differently. How do you feel like that was in your family, Paulina?
So I don't know why, but this reminds me of a book I read, which I've talked about before because I always talk about it. It's called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wallen. And it just talks about how the trauma kind of lives in our DNA. And even though there's like a whole magical world, I'm always like the one that like rains on the parade where like I love to tie the science into the magic all the time. And it's like, bro, if science says it too, and the people are saying it, and spirituality saying it, like it gotta be real. And that's kind of how like my mindset is, where it's like that trauma from my ancestors and the trauma that I've lived and like just all the trauma in the air, I feel like it totally um helps in the fortune field, in the foretelling field aspect, because it just does. You understand people on such a deep and dynamic level.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm thinking too of the advice that my grandmother would give me because she also grew up doing face reading, but that's not something I was taught. She was just like, I can't figure out how to teach you. But it was something that I did absorb over time where she'd be like, oh, anytime that you can see the whites all the way around someone's eyes, that's someone who's unstable. Or like little things where it's
Wow.
like, look at people's shoes. Like, are, do their shoes make sense with what they're wearing? They may or may not be like safe people to be
Mine
around.
definitely don't. Yeah. I have to
I'm
But
go
wearing
look at mine.
socks and
I'm
sandals
too
right
tall to
now.
look at my shoes. What was
You
it?
called me out too personally, okay?
What about socks? If their
I'm
socks don't
wearing
match, what does that
there's a
mean?
lot you can tell from
socks and
socks.
sandals, okay?
But yeah, all kinds of
Sockomancy.
little things. And my mother taught me that if someone is fixating on you in a way where you feel like they might be like getting ready to attack you,
Hmm.
do something with your hands to draw their attention away. And in that moment, that's when you. And this was just I was like 6,
Huh.
like
That's
because
useful.
they had gone through so much. But these things have been really helpful because sometimes you have clients who are also maybe aggressive. I had to
Hmm.
ban someone a few weeks ago from a shop.
Yikes.
And that was a very helpful tip for me.
Yikes.
There's little business things that are not included in the book. Like I remember one of my aunts being like, if they put something down like their keys or, you know, or something they're holding, like cover it with a paper or something. So they have to come back in and then they get, an extra, version of you or something, or like it makes them feel like they want to come back. And so there's sometimes
Okay.
like little things like, because we're depending on we have to pay our bills with this. So like we need return clientele too.
Mhm. Gotcha. Um, what would you say that some of the challenges that Roma people face currently are? And have you seen those improve in your lifetime or not?
That is a good question. It's a big question. Um, there has consistently been for centuries discrimination for Roma with, housing, healthcare, education. There's consistently been police brutality, disproportionate levels of disproportionate levels of poverty, as well as incarceration. Roma experience a tremendous amount of environmental racism because Roma initially were persecuted to the point of nomadism. And then nomadism became another reason to persecute Roma. And many Roma are and continue to be forcibly settled. A lot of the traveling sites are like literally toxic from waste and other environmental issues. But a lot of the settlements all over the world also don't have consistent sanitation, clean water, things like that. And so Roma also exist at all different levels. You know, there are wealthy Roma, there are the poorest of the poor as well. But Roma consistently, especially if you read as a person of color, are discriminated against in a lot of different ways. For instance, if you live in a place where Romani people have a recognizable accent to the, local people, that's, one thing that you'd have to work on to hide. One of our guests, Rowena Marin, who now works at Google, discussed when she was in school in Romania trying to smooth out her Romani accent so she could apply for jobs. Because people might not rent to you, they probably won't hire you, depending. In the US, it's a little bit easier to hide, but, I still had a client come in for a reading, and at the end of the reading, she was like, well, I'm so glad you're one of the good ones because all the gypsies in my area are terrible and I hate them. And she started going on this huge rant. And this is in New Hampshire. And I was just like, okay.
Okay.
But it happens all the time.
It does. And so, when I was a kid in school, I think I'm like ethnically ambiguous. Like I don't clearly read one thing or another. But for New Hampshire, I was very exotic. And so the kids were always wanting to know like where I was from and where I'm from originally. Their parents wanted to know where I was from. And eventually, like at 6 years old, I was like, oh, I'm a gypsy. It's like my grandma told me not to tell you, but I'm sure it's fine. And kids threw rocks at me. I had a teacher give me detention for giving the evil eye. Just
what the hell?
All kinds of all kinds
That's
of
like
nonsense.
So backwards.
It's wildly backwards.
This was in New Hampshire?
This was in New Hampshire. When I was 10, I was wearing a traditional head covering, and the police stopped me because they said I was a runaway and like took me into their car, and I had to like promise them that my dad was just down the street, and it was a nightmare. But Paulina has loads of stories too. But I've noticed that compared to like 10 years ago, when I've, shared my cultural context, more people are like, oh, interesting, rather than say something horrible. And so I do think that there's more awareness, but at the same time, a lot of the really meaningful political action that needs to happen in Europe for change to happen, it's just not happening. And we need much more Romani representation in places like the UN. We need the concept of a stateless nation for Roma in order to execute any kind of real change, because Romani refugees are still being, left with nothing or deported back to war-torn places. Romani people are still being excluded from life-saving healthcare or, struggling to get compensation for forced sterilization, all kinds of really dark things.
Was that in Europe or America?
Yeah, probably both, but it's definitely more documented in Europe.
It happens in America too.
It does. And so, yeah, there has been change. There definitely has been change, but there's still a lot of really shocking things. And so if listeners are interested, checking out the European Roma Rights Center, ERRC, it's a really good resource if you want to know more about the news, but there are all kinds of great Roma organizations that we list on our website, romanistanpodcast.com. Paulina, is there anything you want to share about your experience with like how things have changed over the years with you?
For sure. So my thought on it is like, if I just have to answer like, yes, is it getting better or worse? I would unfortunately say, yes, it is getting better. I say unfortunately, because it's still like so not the best, it's so bad in so many other places, but I would say, like, I think we're moving forward in the overall lens. When I think of countries like Iran and Afghanistan, like especially, oh my gosh, like with Afghanistan, right, like right now, and revoking all these women's like rights, and in order to be out in public, like you have to.
Well, so this is covered. Not to interrupt it. It's so, but I just don't know about this. So it sounds like the people are having problems with extremist Islam also in that part of the world, or Taliban or ISIS or something like what it sounds
I would
similar to what the
say,
Yazidi.
yeah, I would say like extremism, to a degree. And so I feel like when it comes to our society, like in some parts, I feel like those societies are going backwards.
Yeah.
But we don't have a country. So we don't really have anything to base like where we're at, where gypsies are. It really depends on the country that we're in as well. So like the big majority of gypsies that are in Europe, um, they have, done a little bit more programs. They're in school a little bit more. Like things are getting a tiny bit better, but it's still like pretty rough out there. But I wouldn't say like it's going backwards.
About how many Roma are there worldwide, more or less?
There are about 1 million in the US and 14 million worldwide.
Wow. Okay, so not many. About I believe there's 16 million Jews in the world, so somewhat similar. But if I understand this, I don't fully understand this, but it seems to me that is it as simple as if you don't have a state, you don't have the same rights and protections as other groups of people?
For
Yeah,
sure.
I think that's a major aspect of it. And I think that there have been Roma have experienced a tremendous amount of obstacles, but then there's also the issue of Roma have either had to or preferred to deal with it through invisibility. And so trying to fly under the radar as much as possible. And so I think Roma, for that reason, have not been as organized as maybe some other ethnic groups that um, have really, well established organizations and allyship with other BIPOC communities. Like Roma aren't as integrated. And integration is complicated because we don't want to be assimilated. We prefer to be integrated. But sometimes it feels like you'd have to assimilate in order to integrate. And so, every marginalized ethnic group continues to have its struggles. Some Romani struggles are unique. Some of them are shared by other groups. But it's the lack of representation, it's the statelessness, and it's also a fear of visibility or an inability to survive and be visible in certain situations.
In your own efforts of being visible and doing a podcast and being very public, have you faced pushback from people who would prefer that maybe you be more invisible?
Yeah, for the most part, though, people have been like, "Oh, this is so nice. How lovely for a Romani podcast." But with the book specifically, a lot of people maybe were triggered by the word secrets and were like, "Who gave you permission to do this?" Which I don't think they would ever ask a Romani like man about that, but that's my opinion. um,
Okay.
but it's like, who gave you permission to do this? Why are you sharing this? This isn't how we do things. But a lot of our listeners are Roma and are happy to be represented. We're not the only Romani podcast. There's some other great ones out there, like the Romani Tea Room and Dead Scared Entertainment's O Verda Darano and Roman Rum and Amaro Voice and all these really cool podcast initiatives. But I think we're one of the more consistent and longer running podcasts. Um, but yeah, we definitely get people who are mad at us, but we also get a lot of support. Paulina, I love it when you talk about the haters. Is there anything you want to say?
We love the haters. No, I think, all publicity is good publicity. And I think what we're really trying to do and our main goal is like so good on a huge level that even when we do get backlash, it's like whatever, like you're just helping our algorithm at that point. Like, sure, bring it on. Like we've heard it all before. But I get a lot of backlash even today. Like I think I showed you just like some voicemails that I had gotten, like my from my own family, from outsiders. Like I'm constantly in some kind of heat because it's why are you talking about our family? Why are you talking about gypsies in general? Like, why do you trust like the outsiders or Why are you choosing them over us? There's a lot of that us versus them mentality. And I think I would say rightfully so, unfortunately. Um, and maybe it's not all, what I'm saying is that I think I just understand when we're getting backlash or from some of the people, there's an understanding of like, hey, like I know like society has really screwed us over and I could see why you feel that way. And, I'm sorry for the pain that that causes you and everybody else. But at the same time, I have to do what I believe is right, and I believe this is going to help us and help our culture and our future generations to come. So that's kind of my pushback on.
I'm really curious about the experience of growing up being trained in fortune telling from a young age. Like, how does that work? Are there stages that you kind of go through? Are there levels of development or maturity that are expected of somebody who's coming up in that world?
Well, I mean, you always start young, so as soon as you can talk, as soon as you can, speak, really, is when you start. And I've done that with my own kids as well. Like when I run a fair or festival, like it'll be like a donation someone will make, and they actually do really well. But when you get experience from such a young age, um, I think it just sets you up to have that backup. And originally, I didn't feel that way. Originally, I say originally, like just once I once I grew up, I felt like we should be able to choose like what we do or this and that. But now I feel like it's a trade that we have, and we should be able like we should know like if we want to or teach it or whatever. Because I'm kind of on the other side now. Like now I have the kids, like I'm the older generation enforcing it, not enforcing it. I'm not like if they don't want to learn, they're not going to learn. That's the difference. My
Okay.
generation was like, you have to learn, like you can't do anything else. I'm giving them options and I'm like low key like making them learn, like I'm bribing them, you guys.
I see.
Okay.
I see. I see. Yeah, I'm curious how the experience of being a mom and passing that on has changed your view of that cultural practice.
Um, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it definitely changed a lot. I feel like in the sense of wanting them to keep something like traditional, to know how to do the practice, but as well as they can make money off the streets if they needed to. Like, unfortunately, like if my kids needed to like read some palms and walk up to people and like make $5 to eat, like I could totally trust that they could do that. And I feel like that's an important thing to me. But just what was it like being trained from a kid for you?
Kind of, well, similar and different. So, like I had said, I was always told I had options about what I wanted to do. But the way my grandmother explained it was really similar to how you're thinking about it with your kids, where it's like, well, listen, if you ever needed to like make a living with nothing, you could do this very well and you would be fine. And that's the most important thing is that you could survive and thrive. And, for my grandmother, she said she taught me because I was exhibiting signs that I would be good at it. She had taught my mother and my auntie, but without much of a cultural context. But she didn't feel like they would be good fortune tellers because my mother is very psychic or was very psychic. She passed away, um, but she mostly saw misfortune. And my grandmother was like, well, that would be terrible for business. And my auntie was very shy and anxious and didn't like talking to people. And my grandmother was like, oof, you wouldn't be great at that either. So she had them work with horses. But for me, when I was 4, she felt like I was exhibiting some intuition. We wrote about it in the book, like how this started for us as kids. I had run up to her and put her hands on her knees when I was like 3, and her knees were very arthritic. And when I pulled my hands away, it pulled the pain out with them, and I threw it across the room and then like marched away because I was 3. And she was like, "Oh, okay, yeah,
Wow. Wow.
this one, it's time." And so, it started off with her teaching me about dream interpretation, and she didn't use the word meditation, but essentially meditating. And so, like, God bless her, she taught me how to do that when I was 4. How do you teach a 4-year-old to do that? But I was just so enraptured by everything I mean, I loved her so much. that I would do anything that she told me. And so yeah, from then, similar to what Paulina was saying, it's like as soon as you can talk, they start teaching you. And we started, both Paulina and I started reading our families first because they're the people you know best, and you're really just kind of mimicking like what your grandma or your mom or whatever is doing. And then you start to learn the techniques. Like my grandmother first taught me about palm reading, that was the first thing I learned. And she was saying you have to stare at the hands until you can see the stories moving underneath the lines. And so that was a really big thing where, yes, it's good to know what all the lines mean, what all the cards mean, you know, what the symbols mean, but you're supposed to be able to access some deeper knowledge from spending time with people's energy or with their hand. And so there were different stages to what I was learning. I started off with palms, and then we moved into cards, and then we moved into tea, but everything felt very organic. And by the time I was 12, I was reading for my mother's friends at like little parties and stuff that they would have. And I started reading for horses because New Hampshire was pretty conservative, or the part of New Hampshire I was in back then, probably still now. And so people were more interested in being like, why is my horse lame?
Okay.
I'll pay a child to tell me than like getting their own fortunes read.
Okay.
So that's what that looks like for me.
Interesting. So do you think that divination or the psychic abilities are something that can be trained, or do you kind of have to be born to it? And different people have different opinions about this, so I'm curious.
I think it could be worked on. I think it's pretty simple. I mean, I feel like intuition, however you view it or however you see it, it's just your ability to spiritually communicate with people or communicate with people in general. And I think with experience, it could be developed.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that some people might have a predisposition for it, where they might be naturally just very tapped in or be able to do hands-on healing, and maybe they don't need a whole lot of guidance. But I feel like if you really want to learn and you want to practice and do all the ritual and the meditation and the spiritual hygiene and all these things, yeah, I feel like anyone could access their intuition and be able to give a pretty good
Mhm.
reading.
Is there any emphasis or interest in, magical or spiritual practices outside of fortune telling in Roma culture, including ones maybe that aren't, put on display for the public?
Yes. So I would recommend people to look for the artist Mihaela Dragan. It's Mihaela, and then her last name is Dragan. And she co-founded with Zita Moldovan the feminist theater troupe Juvlepen, which is the Romani word for feminism. And they do a lot of performative magical ritual that is rooted in Romani culture, and they collaborate with traditional Romani witches, the Minca and Buția family in Romania. And I think that is a kind of Romani magic that is like appropriate for non-Romani people to partake in, because it's a performance, it's presented a certain way, it's what people want to show. And in terms of what Paulina and I would have written about in the book, would be much more practical types of practices. Like cleaning is its own kind of magic, and bathing is its own kind of magic. And yeah, Paulina, do you want to add to that?
I would say, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what you're saying. It feels like there is little things that I guess little things that we do that might not always be like published or known, like, but some weird things that I'm finding out is the more we're talking about them in the book, and just in general, I feel like, or the more we're seeing them with and talking about them, we're starting to see these little things like the superstitions, like spitting on the broom. Like everybody does that now. I found out, like our little superstitions and stuff. But I agree with you. I agree with you overall. I do have to cut in really quick. I do have to get going. I'm a little bit over my hour.
Okay. Well,
Um,
this is probably a good place to wrap it.
Sorry about
Please,
that.
no problem. This has been a wonderful interview, though, and I feel that I've learned a lot. Please tell people where they can find out more about you and get your book.
Well, you can find out lots about us on romanistanpodcast.com. And you can listen to our podcast anywhere you get podcasts. And also, Paulina's website is romaniholistic.com. Mine is jezminavantila.com. And you can find us both on Instagram, probably more than other social media, but we're on all the social medias. And you can get our book anywhere books are sold online. And also, it'll be in stores October 7th. And ask your local library and small bookstores for sure.
All
But yeah,
right.
thank you so much for having us. This was so much fun. You asked such insightful questions.
Thank you. And if you have
Yeah.
time, one last question. What's one fortune telling tip you can offer people who are doing their own readings? And but if you need to go now, that's okay.
I love this question. All right, well, you go first, Jess.
So I think my favorite tip is if you're reading for someone else, this sounds so obvious, but never apologize unless you do something actually offensive. But I've met a lot of readers who are like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not totally sure about this. Or like, I'm sorry. I don't exactly predict the future. Never apologize. Even if you're running a couple minutes late, it's more of a like, thank you so much for being patient. Come with me. And it just be confident in what you do. And if you forget what something means, whatever thought is available to you is what you're supposed to tell them. So don't apologize.
That's great life advice too.
Yeah. I think my advice is to stay chill. I feel that we get so nervous, like still now, like now I'm so good. Like when I work in stores where there's other readers, which I'm not currently doing at the moment, but when I am, I feel like um I guess people come in but whatever it is, like the skeptics, I'm saying they always give the skeptics to me because they know that I'm just so good at dealing with people that are skeptics. I think people should understand it as a spiritual practice. So as you begin your reading, if you're dealing with a difficult person, or whether you think they're even difficult or not, um, just to connect with, just start off by saying, hey, like this is our, this is a spiritual cultural practice. So we just hope that you can be open throughout the process. So I kind of like call it out as soon as it's there, or if someone's like tense, don't take it personal. They're probably nervous about their own life or whatever it is. And knock on wood, I've never had this, before, but if someone actually doesn't like you, it's not the end of the world. Like, oh well, someone doesn't like you, move on to the next. That's my advice.
Also good life advice. All
Yeah.
right. Well, this has been an awesome podcast. Thank you both very much. And
Thank you
Thank
great,
so much
great,
you.
for having
thank you.
us. Yeah.
And great luck with your book as well.